Hi, this is Jack Downs with a brief run-through of the floating positioning exercise. This is a new and updated version, which includes the Flexbox. Your first look, if you're in 317, probably your first look at Flexbox also. Okay, so here we are with the file that you have downloaded, and there's an image to download too. Assume you do that and you have your instructions on it, and when you first run it, it looks like this. Oh no, it's a picture of me. Well, maybe me on a bad hair day. More about that later. But what do we have here? You'll see we've got two starts of navigation. This will be your first look at navigation also. It's thrown in here. We have an image, sitting like images usually do. It's at the beginning of a paragraph, sort of going with the flow. We've got a couple of different paragraphs here that say left and right, but are stacked up. Some others that say left and right are stacked up. A footer, a little bit of text down here. And let's go look at the code. In this code, you'll see an area called floating positioning begins here. We'll be working there first, and then I've divided it up in other ways as we go along, things we'll be using and doing and looking at. Otherwise, a lot of the selectors and so on are made for you already. See, here's our two parts of our navigation. Good. Then we have a div called main. All right, good. Then we have a span. Okay. And the span includes an image. Here's the image. Span is just a generic container that's holding our image. Why are we doing a span? It'll become apparent in just a minute. Image, there's the image name. That's why the image is there. So you don't have to put that in. Your instructions may mention adding the image, but it's already there for you. So what are we going to do? The first thing we want to do is float this image. You see the image right now is at the start of a paragraph, and it just flows from that paragraph down through. We hit the image, then we hit the paragraph. But we want the text to flow around it. So we do that with a float. Now we're not going to apply that to the image directly. We're going to apply it to the span that's containing it, which is either would be fine. But you'll see, because we want to use a caption, you'll see why we're using a span, or we could have used a div if this were up above or something as a separate block element. So that span was an ID of Jack, so we'll look for hashtag Jack. And there happens to be one right up in this area which says floating positioning begins here, hashtag Jack. We'll tell it to float. And that simply is, the command is simply float. And let's tell it to float to the left. Left and right are the two main choices, pretty much the only choices. Let's run that. Look what happened. What's the difference? Before, the image was sitting on top as part of the flow. Now the text is running around it. Text is running around it, which is how we usually want images to be used. So, however, we would like to have some space around it a little bit, and we'd like to put it over on the right also. So let's go ahead and we're going to give it a little bit of space, little margins, and we're going to tell it to float to the right. Now, when it goes over here to the right, we don't want any margin on the top or on the right. We want the margin on the left and on the bottom. Can you imagine that? Like over here, we would not want it on the top or on the left. We would want it on the right and on the bottom. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do a margin. Well, we'll tell it to float right first, just to see the other way it floats. And now we're going to take a margin. Okay, so TRBL, remember top, right, bottom, left. Top and right don't get any. So 0, that's 0, 0, 2EM, 2EM. Semicolon. Save and run it. There it is, floating over here nicely. Okay, so we did the float. Good job. Next, we'd like to add a caption for it. And here's the text I want you to write for the caption. You can just write what I write. And we're going to imagine we're just going to put the caption in the text that follows the image, right? But first, we're going to do it kind of wrong, but I want to show you the idea. You probably have a guess about where you would put this. But let's imagine that we're going to put it right here. Just put some space there to make it a little easier to see. And I'm going to imagine that there's the image, there's the close of the span. I'm just going to put the text right in here. And the text is going to say something like, Jack Downs on a bad hair day. Wow, looks like he needs some dental work. must be all that candy eats. Good. So I'm going to save that and run it, and you know what's going to happen, right? The text is there, but it's at the start of the paragraph, but we want it down here, right? Of course, we have to put it in the same container as the image. That's why we have the image in a container to begin with, because when we're going to use text with an image, they both need to be floated with the same container to be held together, right? So we're going to take that text, cut it out of there, and put it inside the span. Good. And save it and run it. But something still went wrong. What's going on here? How come that text is not underneath the image? How come it's wider than the image, too? Well, the thing about text is, to float properly, it needs a width. Images, by their nature, have width, so they float. But text does not. So we have to tell the text to have a width. And that width is going to be the same width as the image. And if you saw the name of the image, you know I named the image 600. That's because it's 600 pixels wide. That's a nice thing about naming images with their widths. So therefore, we're going to make that be the width added also to that same span. Yes, we could put some other container around that text, like a paragraph, and give that itself its width, but we can just go ahead and do it to the span. The span contains everything. So we say width 600 pixels. So this will work. Save and run. There it is. But we'd like that text for captions to look a little different. Here's my suggestions about some of the things you might do to caption text, perhaps on your resume itself when you do yours. Let's make it bold. These are all optional, which you do what you want on your resume, but here, do this. Bold. And let's take the font size up a little bit. And let's take the line height down a little bit. The idea is that the lines of a caption are usually a little tighter together, and the text is perhaps a little bigger, and maybe bold, maybe not. But you can see how this will make it distinctive. And we won't confuse that text with other text on the page. Okay, so that's how we do a caption with a photo, and we float it also. Now let's take a look at this contact text. I have this contact text sitting here. It's got some BRs in it, so things go on their own lines, but we would like you to float it and make it distinctive. Just plain old floated text. And here is that stuff. Contact is down in the HTML right here. It's another span, has an ID of contact. So there's the span. It's just got text in it. The BRs are only used because we do want certain things on certain lines, not for spacing purposes. So it's appropriate use of BRs. We're not using the fake paragraphs. It feels like it belongs in a single paragraph, sort of thing. It's actually part of this paragraph, really, but now we're going to make it float. It's going to float right here beside that paragraph. So we're looking at the ID contact, and here we are. Oops, not there, not there. Contact, here we are. Okay. So what do we want to do? Well, we're going to tell the contact stuff to have a float left. Now, you can imagine, because I just told you, that the issue with the text is it needs to have width, or else it's not going to float. So just give it some width. How about 200 pixels? And the other things we want to do, please excuse the noise of shuffling paper as I get my notes here, is we want to, well, let's take a look and see what this does. It's going to float, and it's going to have width. Well, it's going to float because it has width. Yeah, it's there, and it is floating now, but it's kind of like still blurred in with the rest of the text. We have to make it distinctive. So what do we have? We can use the box model. Let's go ahead and tell it to have some padding, space inside the box, of like 1 EM. Let's tell it to have a background color of white. Let's tell it to have a margin to push other things around. And this time we want no margin on the left side because it is already on the left side. 2EM, 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 0. Let's see that now. Oops. Wrong one. And scroll down and we'll see, oh, I know what I forgot to do. Hold on. Sorry, a little glitch there. I had forgotten to put in one of my semicolons, and that was causing this not to work. So now I save and run it. And there I am. Now my text is floating, and it is set off nicely, just like that. Good. Okay, now we're going to move along to making the columns. Okay. So there's two major ways to, well, at this point there's more than that, but there's two ways you'll learn to make things into multiple columns. One way is the older way, which is floating, and then the other way is the newer way, which is Flexbox. So we have these columns down here called left and right. There's a number of ways we could make one go to the left, one go to the right. Our idea is we're going to float them both to the left, but they're going to need to have some size in order to float because they're just text. Okay? If we float multiple things to the left, they will stack up beside each other. If we used hard units, they wouldn't flex, so we're going to use percentages. So let's go ahead and give this a try. I'm going to go into the code again. Now I have this left and right here. And that's hashtags, those are IDs that applies to those paragraphs. Here it is. There's a paragraph with a div of left and one with a div of right. Okay? So here I am in left and right again. Plain old left and right. Here we are. So let's give them each a width of 47%. Why 47? It'll be apparent in a moment. Because that leaves over just enough for a little bit of a gutter between them. 47 and 47. Copy that and paste it in. Okay, and we're going to tell them each to float to the left. Okay, I'm going to save and run it. And there they are. They're floating to the left and the right, but something's happened. This whole footer thing is jammed up here. What's going on? This is a clear situation. When you float things, then the next thing in the order has to clear. The next thing that goes out of into the regular flow again clears, and that is the footer. So we have to tell the footer to have a clear. Ooh, clear. Now we can say clear left. That would be fine. Clear right would not work. Or we can clear both, which we might as well say, even though there's only lefts there to clear. So we're clearing floats. Now that footer goes back and behaves properly, but we don't have any gutter here. And that's why we did the 47 and 47. We can put a margin right on the left one of like 5%. And that will add up to almost 100%, which is fine. Margin left, 5%. There it goes. Oops, sorry, margin right on the left one, not over there on the other side. Yes, yes, yes. Or we could have margin left on the right one, would have been the same thing. There it is. And what happened if we went more than 100%? You don't have to do this part. Let's say I put 10 in here, or 19 for that matter, if you wish. What happens is they don't float anymore because there's not room for them to float beside there. So we need to have that number be less than 100%. Or if we're using pixels, we need to know how big that space is so that it'll fit in there. Okay, and because we have used percentages, this will be flexible. More in just a moment. Okay, so I was just going to show you the idea that it was flexible. And here we are looking at those two paragraphs. We make them smaller, and they flex down nicely. Okay, so let's continue then. Let's take a look at some absolute positioning next. We have this piece of text here. It says, warning, this is not a photo of Jack Downs. We want that to be up on top of the image. Okay, well, that's not part of the flow. That's moving it out of the flow completely. That's what we have to do with absolute positioning. So here's how we do it. That piece of text, which is way down here someplace, there it is. It has an ID of warning. This paragraph has an ID of warning, right? Okay, so I'm going to take that CSS, here we are, up here with the warning, and we're going to tell that thing to have some special styling to make it stand out, to look like a warning, and have width, again, just like floating, positioning text needs width. So let's start with the width. Here we go. Width, again, 200 pixels will be fine for a little boxed piece of text. Padding, again, to a little space on the inside, 1 EM. Let's give it a color of red. Nice for a warning. That's the text color, but it's the foreground color. Background color, we can tell that to be, how about white? And position, absolute. That's what's going to do the positioning. Position absolute. There's some other possibilities to use for position that you can read about in your text. Absolute positioning is the most likely positioning that you will use. Now we have to give it a top of a number. We'll just throw a number out there, and then a left of a number. We'll just throw a number out there. You have to do trial and error with these numbers. These numbers are how far down from the top, how far over from the left. So it's like an XY grid, really. Let's run this. Okay, so now my text is over here, but it's a little high. I want to go down here. Oh, well, I have to drop it down further, so I will change this 300 to a 500 maybe. Yours will be different if your monitor size is different. And that's one of the problems here. That this is now absolutely positioned, it's true, but it's absolutely positioned in terms of this super home position, which doesn't necessarily work well if we change the width of the page. If you want to do the extra credit on this assignment, you'll have to read more about absolute positioning and see how you could move this piece of text to somewhere in this HTML differently and set it based on the absolute positioning that would apply to this image. And then it would always stay there. Because what's going to happen now is if this gets narrower, that text is going to stay in its position based on the super home position. So this is fine for this exercise to get the general idea of absolute positioning, but we have to set a containing block. And you can learn more about that in the extra credit if you choose to do that. But let's continue with this. At least you got the idea of absolute positioning. Now let's go ahead and learn about this. Look at this navigation briefly. These two sets of navigation, they are starting as unordered lists, which is how navigation almost always does start. I have given you some code here. We'll skip the flex columns. This navigation stuff below starts with flex. If I release this code, you'll see what happens here. I've taken these ULs and given them a display of flex. That's the key thing that makes things flex. This is the first look you've had at Flexbox. I have to name these, I had to give them an ID, which is different, to make them different from the other UL, the other A, and the other states, like link states. You also see in navigation that we break some of our rules about how we write link states. We have fewer of them. And I have something called a here, which is a way to make the place where we are look differently. In other words, it's a you are here thing. The place where you are in the navigation can look different, which is an option also. So I'm going to mostly just run this, give it to you and let you just run it and then look at it and try to understand it. You may very well be cribbing from and are using portions of and restyling this kind of navigation for you. More navigation another time. Let's run this. See what this has done? It's given us some hover And also, although we have a hover, we have a different looking home. The assumption is this is the home page. Little curved borders on here. If you look now through this code, you can see where the border radius is that's creating that, the padding that's creating that, the margin, the color, the background color, all that stuff is in there. That's how we can do a flex navigation. I think most navigation these days on new pages is made with flex. Here's a floating navigation. It uses a few different features. One is this special overflow auto, which is a special thing that allows us to put color on the div when everything inside of it is floating, because we have to float things in the floating navigation. That color is a tan color. We're using the div itself to put color on it now. We go to these A's, the links themselves. We tell them to behave like blocks. That's another idea. And we float all these guys here. Float them all the LIs to the left. Run that. Again, another idea of navigation. You could put the color bar on this one up here too, just so you see two different examples. One has it, one doesn't have it. So that's some navigation. I encourage you to start thinking about navigation. Look through these examples. Try to understand them. You'll understand more as we go along. Save these, though, because you may very well crib from them for the navigation for your pages. Finally, let's do the flex columns. We have two more columns down here to go left and right. And now you'll see a little bit more about how flex really works. So the amount of code that we have to write for flex columns, making these columns behave properly using the flex system is actually not that much at all. In some ways, the flex system is a little bit easier, although it can be a little hard to get your head around. I think you may have to read and reread parts of that chapter a couple of times to really understand it. The first thing we do is we have a container and we have flex items. Let's go look at this stuff to see what it looks like in the HTML. Here it is. So not there, the columns we are on now. Here they are. I have a div called with an ID of container. It goes around these two chunks of stuff, which I'm calling these little column areas, right? And I've given each one of these a div with a class of flex item. We're using classes because it's used more than once. So container goes around the whole thing, flex item goes around each one. Remember, these names don't mean anything, although they are tradition at this point that we use these kinds of names in flexing. But we have to tell the CSS what to do with those names. Let's go back up to that area. Here we are. So the container, we have to tell it to display flex. So what does that do? Let's take a look. By itself, that does the floating type operation. There they are. One there, just like that. There's a little more that we want to do, though. We want to give each of these guys a width. And again, we could use pixels, but we might as well use something that's flexible. Let's use percentages. Let's use, oops, I don't have my cap lock on. Let's go ahead and tell each item, these are flex items, each individual item to have a width of 48%. Because they have both the same class, we just have to use it once. So that's going to give them a width. Let's run it again. A little space will be left over, but right now the space is left over at the end. We want the space in the middle. Yes, we could use a margin for that, but there's another way to do it. We can tell these items to justify content space between. In other words, put the extra space between. And this is, again, for the entire container. Everything in the container is a justify content space between. Justify content space between. So in other words, take the extra space and put it between the items. There's a number of possible things we could stick in here, like centering and so on. And that's it. That's all we have to do to flex those, to make those columns behave like multiple columns. And here we go. I'm going to make this narrower. You can see that it flexes just like the rest of it did there too. Everything flexes except for the size of our photo. That's a different matter. but we still get a lot of responsive design there to changes in screen size. Okay, that's your first look at navigation styling. I went over that very quickly, I know. Spend some time with it, please. That's also your first look at Flexbox. Well, the last thing I want to say is please make sure to look over my presentation on these topics in the PDF form. And finally, please make sure to read over these chapters carefully. I know it's easy to skip the reading, but these are very important chapters.